When millionaire Marcus Wellington saw the manager humiliating his adopted daughter at the luxury store, his protective instincts exploded in a way that would change everything forever. The rain hammered against the windows of Grandview Shopping Center as 17-year-old Sofia Rodriguez clutched her worn backpack tighter against her chest. Her heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and terror as she stepped through the gleaming glass doors of Prestige Fashion Boutique, one of the most exclusive stores in the entire mall. Sofia had saved every penny from her part-time job at the local diner for months, working double shifts and skipping meals just to afford a single dress. Today wasn't just any day. It was the day before her high school graduation, and despite everything she'd been through, she was determined to walk across that stage with dignity. The contrast between Sofia's modest appearance and the opulent surroundings couldn't have been starker. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow reflections across marble floors, while designer gowns hung like works of art behind pristine glass displays. The air carried the subtle scent of expensive perfume and leather, a world so far removed from the cramped apartment she shared with her foster family. "Can I help you?" The voice cut through the ambient classical music like a blade. Sofia turned to see Victoria Sterling, the store manager, approaching with an expression that could freeze fire. Victoria's perfectly styled hair and immaculate appearance commanded respect, but her eyes held something else entirely: judgment, cold, and unforgiving. "Yes, please," Sofia replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm looking for a graduation dress, something nice but not too expensive." Victoria's gaze swept over Sofia from head to toe, taking in her faded jeans, scuffed sneakers, and the small holes in her sweater. The assessment lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity to Sofia, who suddenly felt every imperfection magnified under that scrutinizing stare. "I see," Victoria said, her tone dripping with barely concealed disdain. "And what exactly is your budget for this graduation dress?" Sofia's cheeks burned with embarrassment as she reached into her backpack and pulled out a crumpled envelope. "I have $300, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I know it's not much, but I've been saving for months." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's perfectly painted lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like the expression a cat might wear while playing with a wounded mouse. $300. Victoria repeated, loud enough for other customers to hear. "For a dress from Prestige Fashion Boutique." Sofia felt the weight of every stare in the store. Wealthy customers paused their browsing to watch the unfolding scene, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright amusement. She wanted nothing more than to disappear through the floor, but something inside her, a stubborn flame that had kept her going through years in the foster system, refused to let her run. "I understand if that's not enough," Sofia said, her voice gaining strength. "But I was hoping maybe you had something on sale, or from last season." Victoria's laugh was sharp and cutting. "Oh, my dear girl, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This isn't a thrift store or a discount outlet. Our dresses start at $800, and that's for our most basic pieces." The words hit Sofia like physical blows. $800, more than she made in 2 months at the diner. She felt her dreams crumbling, but refused to let the tears that threatened to spill over her cheeks. "Perhaps," Victoria continued, her voice growing louder and more theatrical, "you might be more comfortable at one of the department stores downstairs. They have a lovely selection of more affordable options." The way she said affordable made it sound like a disease. Sofia felt the familiar sting of being made to feel small, worthless, less than human. It was a feeling she'd experienced countless times in various foster homes, at school, in countless situations where her circumstances made her an easy target. But as Sofia stood there, surrounded by luxury she could never afford and facing humiliation she didn't deserve, something unexpected happened. The front door chimed, and a man entered the store with the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention. Marcus Wellington moved through the world like someone accustomed to having it bend to his will. At 55, he was distinguished in the way that came from success, confidence, and the kind of wealth that opened every door. His tailored suit spoke of quality without ostentation, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence that had built his business empire from nothing. Marcus had come to Prestige Fashion Boutique for a simple reason: to pick up the custom evening gown he'd ordered for his wife's upcoming charity gala. But as he stepped into the store, his attention was immediately drawn to the scene unfolding near the evening wear section. He watched as Victoria Sterling, whom he recognized from previous visits, continued her verbal assault on a young woman who couldn't have been much older than his own daughter would have been. "Really, dear," Victoria was saying, her voice now carrying to every corner of the store, "I think you need to be realistic about your situation. Perhaps you should focus on more practical concerns than trying to fit into a world where you clearly don't belong." Marcus felt something cold and hard settle in his chest as he observed the young woman's reaction. Despite the obvious humiliation, she stood straighter, lifted her chin, and looked Victoria directly in the eye. "I work hard for my money," Sophia said, her voice clear and steady despite the tremor Marcus could detect beneath the surface. "I've never asked for charity or special treatment. I just wanted to buy a dress to celebrate my graduation. I didn't realize that made me unwelcome here." The dignity in her response, the quiet strength she displayed in the face of such cruelty, struck Marcus like lightning. There was something about this girl, something in her posture, her voice, the way she refused to be broken by Victoria's calculated cruelty, that awakened memories he'd spent years trying to bury. Marcus moved closer, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet, as Victoria prepared to deliver what was clearly intended to be a final, crushing blow. "Listen carefully," Victoria said, leaning forward with predatory satisfaction, "because I'm only going to explain this once. This store caters to a certain clientele, people who understand quality, who appreciate luxury, who belong in this environment. I simply cannot have someone like you disturbing our other customers or creating the wrong impression about our brand." The words hung in the air like poison, and Marcus saw something break in the young woman's eyes. Not her spirit, but her last hope that the world might treat her fairly. That's when Marcus Wellington made a decision that would change everything. Marcus Wellington stepped forward with the measured precision of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. His presence seemed to shift the very atmosphere of the boutique, causing conversations to halt and heads to turn. Even Victoria Sterling, caught mid-sentence in her verbal assault, found herself momentarily speechless as she recognized one of the store's most valued customers. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of commanding boardrooms and making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation." Victoria's demeanor transformed instantly, like a chameleon adapting to new surroundings. The cruel smile vanished, replaced by the practiced charm she reserved for her wealthiest clientele. Her posture straightened, and suddenly she was all professional courtesy and artificial warmth. "Mr. Wellington," she exclaimed, her voice now honey-sweet, "what a pleasure to see you again. I was just explaining to this young lady that perhaps our store isn't quite the right fit for her particular needs." Sophia felt her cheeks burn with renewed humiliation. Being dismissed was painful enough, but having it happen in front of this distinguished stranger made everything worse. She clutched her backpack tighter and took a step backward, preparing to flee before she could be embarrassed further. But Marcus wasn't looking at Victoria. His attention was entirely focused on Sophia, and there was something in his expression that she couldn't quite interpret. It wasn't pity. She'd seen enough of that to recognize it immediately. It wasn't disgust or dismissal like Victoria's cruel assessment. It was something else entirely, something that made her pause mid-retreat. Her particular needs, Marcus repeated slowly, testing the words as if they left a bad taste in his mouth. And what exactly would those be, Ms. Sterling? Victoria's confidence wavered slightly. She'd expected Marcus to either ignore the situation entirely or perhaps even support her position. After all, didn't wealthy people prefer to shop in exclusive environments, free from the presence of those who couldn't afford to belong? Well, Victoria began, glancing between Marcus and Sophia uncertainly, as I explained to the young lady, our price points start at $800. She mentioned having a budget of only $300, which obviously puts our entire collection well beyond her reach. I was simply trying to save everyone time and disappointment by directing her to more suitable establishments. The way she emphasized suitable made Sophia's stomach clench. She'd heard that tone before, in foster homes where she was made to feel like an unwelcome burden, at schools where teachers looked at her address and automatically lowered their expectations, in countless situations where her circumstances were used to define her worth as a human being. Marcus turned his attention back to Sophia, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle in a way that caught her completely off guard. $300, he said thoughtfully. That's quite a significant amount for someone your age to save. May I ask what the occasion is? Sophia hesitated, uncertain whether this was genuine interest or another setup for humiliation. But something in his eyes encouraged honesty. My high school graduation, she said quietly. It's tomorrow. Graduation, Marcus repeated, and Sophia could have sworn she saw something flicker across his face, a shadow of emotion that was there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. That's a tremendous accomplishment. You should be proud. The simple acknowledgement hit Sophia like a physical force. When was the last time an adult had told her she should be proud of something? When had anyone treated her achievements as worthy of celebration rather than mere expectations to be met? Thank you, she whispered, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. Victoria shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to handle this unexpected turn in the conversation. She'd been so certain that Marcus would either ignore the situation or support her position. This gentle interest in the girl's story was not part of her script. Mr. Wellington, Victoria interjected, forcing brightness into her voice. Your wife's gown is ready for pickup. Perhaps we could handle that transaction and then... The gown can wait, Marcus said without taking his eyes off Sophia. I'm more interested in hearing about this young lady's graduation. What are your plans afterward? College? Sophia's throat tightened. This was the question she'd been dreading, the one that highlighted everything she didn't have, everything that seemed impossible for someone in her situation. I've been accepted to State University, she said carefully. I received an academic scholarship that covers most of the tuition. I'll be working to cover the rest. Marcus nodded approvingly. Academic scholarship. That's impressive. What's your intended major? Social work, Sophia replied, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about her dreams. I want to help kids in the foster system, kids who need advocates. The words hung in the air between them, and Sophia immediately regretted revealing so much. She'd essentially announced her background to everyone within hearing distance, confirming what Victoria had already suspected about her circumstances. But Marcus didn't react with pity or awkwardness. Instead, his expression grew more interested, more engaged. Foster care, he said quietly. That takes tremendous strength to overcome, and even more strength to want to help others in similar situations. Sophia stared at him in shock. In her experience, adults either pitied foster kids or viewed them with suspicion, as if their circumstances indicated some fundamental flaw in character. But Marcus spoke as if her background was something to be respected rather than hidden. Victoria, meanwhile, was growing increasingly agitated by the direction of the conversation. This wasn't how interactions with difficult customers were supposed to go. Marcus was supposed to appreciate her protection of the store's exclusive atmosphere, not engage in lengthy conversations with someone who clearly didn't belong. Mr. Wellington? She tried again, her voice developing a slight edge. I really think we should handle your wife's order. I'm sure this young lady understands that she needs to find something more within her price range. Actually, Marcus said, turning to face Victoria with an expression that made her take an involuntary step backward, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding here. His voice remained calm, but there was something beneath the surface that made the temperature in the store seem to drop several degrees. Other customers began to drift closer, sensing drama unfolding. You see, Marcus continued, his words measured and deliberate, you've just spent the last several minutes humiliating a remarkable young woman based solely on your assumptions about her financial situation and her worthiness to shop in your establishment. Victoria's face began to flush. I was simply being realistic about our price points. No, Marcus interrupted, and now his voice carried the steel that had made him one of the most feared negotiators in the business world. You were being cruel. You took pleasure in making this girl feel small, unwelcome, and worthless, and you did it publicly, ensuring maximum humiliation. The store fell silent except for the soft jazz playing through the sound system. Even the air conditioning seemed to quiet as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Sophia watched in amazement as this stranger, this wealthy, powerful man who owed her nothing, prepared to defend her against someone who held all the social and economic advantages in this situation. Furthermore, Marcus continued, his gaze never leaving Victoria's increasingly pale face, you've demonstrated exactly the kind of classist attitude that gives businesses like this a reputation for caring more about social status than actual customer service. Victoria opened her mouth to protest, but Marcus wasn't finished. This young woman came into your store with money she worked hard to earn, seeking to purchase something meaningful for one of the most important days of her life, and your response was to treat her like she was somehow contaminating your precious atmosphere. Sophia felt tears beginning to flow, but for the first time in years, they weren't tears of humiliation or despair. They were tears of gratitude, of relief, of finally having someone stand up for her when she couldn't stand up for herself. The tension in Prestige Fashion Boutique had reached a crescendo that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. Other customers had abandoned any pretense of shopping, instead forming a loose circle around the unfolding drama like spectators at a gladiatorial arena. The soft jazz music continued to play, creating an almost surreal soundtrack to the confrontation that was about to explode. Victoria Sterling's face had transformed from its earlier cruel confidence to something approaching panic. She'd dealt with difficult customers before, handled complaints and returns with practiced ease, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for this moment. Marcus Wellington wasn't just any wealthy customer. He was part of the store's elite clientele, the kind of person whose displeasure could end careers with a single phone call. Mr. Wellington, Victoria began, her voice now trembling slightly as she attempted damage control. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was simply following store policy regarding customers who might not be able to afford our merchandise. It's standard practice to... Standard practice. Marcus's voice cut through her explanation like a blade through silk. The quiet authority he'd maintained was beginning to crack, revealing something far more dangerous beneath the surface. Your standard practice is to humiliate teenagers based on their appearance, to make assumptions about their character based on their clothing. Sophia watched in amazement as this powerful stranger continued to defend her. She'd spent years learning to expect the worst from adults, to prepare herself for disappointment and rejection. But here was someone who not only saw her as worthy of respect, but was willing to risk social awkwardness to ensure she received it. Marcus took a step closer to Victoria, and his voice dropped to a tone that somehow managed to be both quieter and more threatening than his previous words. Let me tell you what I see when I look at this young woman. I see someone who worked multiple jobs to save $300 for a single dress. I see someone who earned an academic scholarship through her own merit. I see someone who survived a system that fails most children and emerged with enough compassion to dedicate her life to helping others." With each word, Victoria seemed to shrink smaller, but Marcus wasn't finished. "And then I look at you," he continued, his gaze never leaving Victoria's increasingly pale face, "and I see someone who took pleasure in trying to destroy that young woman's dignity, someone who used her position of authority to inflict emotional pain on a child who has already endured more hardship than you could possibly imagine." The word child hit the store like a thunderclap. Sophia was 17, legally still a minor, and suddenly every adult in that boutique was forced to confront the reality that they had just witnessed the systematic humiliation of a teenager by a grown woman in a position of power. But it was what happened next that would change everything. As Marcus spoke, something in his expression shifted. The controlled anger remained, but underneath it, Sophia glimpsed something she recognized all too well, the deep, abiding pain of someone who had lost something precious and irreplaceable. "You see," Marcus said, his voice becoming quieter but somehow more intense, "I know exactly what it feels like to watch someone dismiss a remarkable young woman based on prejudice and assumptions. I know what it costs when adults fail to protect the children who need them most." Sophia felt her breath catch. There was something in his tone, something in the way his hands clenched at his sides, that suggested this wasn't just about her anymore. This was personal for him in a way that went far deeper than simple outrage at injustice. Marcus turned to address the growing crowd of onlookers, his voice carrying clearly throughout the store. "How many of you were planning to continue shopping here after witnessing what just happened? How many of you feel comfortable patronizing an establishment where staff members are encouraged to humiliate customers based on their economic status?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sophia watched as several customers exchanged uncomfortable glances, suddenly forced to confront their own complicity in the scene they'd just witnessed. Victoria realized with growing horror that her career was unraveling in real time. "Mr. Wellington, please, I was just trying to maintain the store's standards." "Standards?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Your standards apparently include making children feel worthless. Your standards include public humiliation as a business practice. Tell me, Ms. Sterling, how does that reflect on Prestige Fashion's corporate values?" The mention of corporate values sent a visible shudder through Victoria. She understood the implication. This conversation wouldn't end here. Marcus Wellington had the connections and influence to ensure that corporate headquarters heard about this incident in vivid detail. But Sophia was watching Marcus's face, and she saw something else happening beneath his righteous anger. She saw grief, raw and barely contained, the kind that came from wounds that never fully healed. "Sir," Sophia said quietly, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the store, "you don't have to do this for me." Marcus turned to her, and for a moment his carefully constructed composure cracked completely. When he looked at Sophia, this brave, resilient young woman who was trying to protect him from the consequences of defending her, something inside him shattered and rebuilt itself simultaneously. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion he could no longer hide, "I do." And then, in a moment that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives, Marcus Wellington did something that shocked even himself. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, but instead of making a call, he opened his photo gallery. His hands trembled slightly as he scrolled through images until he found what he was looking for. The photo he turned towards Sophia showed a young girl, perhaps 16, with dark hair and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and determination. She wore a simple dress and was holding a graduation cap, smiling at the camera with the kind of joy that seemed to light up the entire image. "Her name was Isabella," Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly. "She was my daughter, not biologically. We adopted her when she was 15, after she'd been in foster care for 3 years. Sophia's eyes widened as she stared at the photograph. The resemblance wasn't physical. Isabella had been lighter-skinned with different features, but there was something in her expression, in the way she held herself, that reminded Sophia of her own reflection. She was brilliant, Marcus continued, his words coming faster now, as if a dam had burst inside him. Straight-A student, full scholarship to university, wanted to be a lawyer so she could advocate for children in the system. She used to say that her past didn't define her, that what mattered was what she chose to do with her future. The store had fallen completely silent. Even Victoria seemed frozen in place, understanding that she was witnessing something profound and irreversible. The night before her high school graduation, Marcus's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, she went to buy a dress for the ceremony. She had saved her own money, just like you did. She was so excited, so proud of herself for achieving something that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Sophia felt tears beginning to flow as she began to understand where this story was heading. She went to a store very much like this one, Marcus continued, his eyes never leaving the photograph. And the saleswoman treated her exactly the way Miss Sterling treated you today. She was humiliated, dismissed, made to feel small and worthless on what should have been one of the happiest days of her life. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Isabella never made it to her graduation, Marcus said finally, his voice barely audible. That night, the pain of being treated like she was worth nothing, like her accomplishments meant nothing, like she would never belong anywhere, it became too much for her to bear. The implications of his words hit the store like a physical force. Several customers gasped audibly, and Sophia felt her knees nearly buckle as the full weight of what he was telling her sank in. Marcus looked up from the photograph and met Sophia's eyes directly. So when I tell you that I have to do this, when I tell you that I cannot and will not stand by and watch another remarkable young woman be treated the way Isabella was treated, I need you to understand that this isn't charity. This isn't pity. This is me refusing to let history repeat itself. The revelation of Isabella's tragic fate had transformed the atmosphere in Prestige Fashion Boutique from mere social drama into something approaching sacred ground. The weight of Marcus's confession hung in the air like incense, heavy and transformative, touching every person present in ways they hadn't expected when they'd entered the store that morning. Sophia stood frozen, clutching her backpack against her chest, as if it could somehow shield her from the overwhelming emotions crashing over her. She understood now why Marcus's defense of her had felt so fierce, so personal. She wasn't just a stranger being treated unfairly. She was a living reminder of the daughter he'd lost, a second chance at intervention that he'd been denied years earlier. Victoria Sterling, meanwhile, had gone completely pale. The cruel satisfaction she'd derived from humiliating Sophia had evaporated entirely, replaced by the dawning horror of understanding exactly what her actions represented. She wasn't just a store manager who'd been rude to a customer. She was someone who had inflicted the same type of psychological wounds that had proven fatal to another young woman. I didn't know," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible, but even as the words left her lips, she understood how inadequate they were. Not knowing Marcus's personal tragedy didn't excuse her behavior. It only highlighted how routine her cruelty had become. Marcus carefully placed his phone back in his pocket, the photograph of Isabella disappearing from view, but not from the collective consciousness of everyone who had witnessed its revelation. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who had spent years wrestling with grief and regret. "Isabella believed in justice," he said, addressing Sophia directly but speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. She believed that people's worth wasn't determined by their bank accounts or their zip codes. She believed that kindness was a choice, not a luxury reserved for those who could afford it. Sophia felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but she made no effort to wipe them away. The pain in Marcus's voice was palpable, but there was something else there too, a determination that seemed to grow stronger with each word he spoke. She also believed, Marcus continued, his gaze shifting to encompass the entire store, that silence in the face of injustice was complicity, that good people had an obligation to speak up when they witnessed wrongdoing, regardless of how uncomfortable it might make them. Several customers shifted nervously, understanding that they were being called to account for their own inaction during Sophia's humiliation. The comfortable distance of being mere observers had been stripped away, replaced by the uncomfortable reality that their silence had been a choice. Marcus turned back to Victoria, and when he spoke, his voice carried the cold precision of someone delivering a verdict. Miss Sterling, in the space of 20 minutes, you have demonstrated everything that was wrong with the treatment Isabella received. You made assumptions based on appearance. You derived pleasure from making someone feel inferior. You used your position of authority to inflict psychological harm on a minor. And you did it all while representing a business that claims to value excellence and customer service. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but Marcus held up a hand to stop her. But more than that, he continued relentlessly, you did it in front of witnesses who could have spoken up at any time. You created a situation where everyone present was forced to choose between comfort and conscience, and most chose comfort. The indictment extended beyond Victoria to encompass everyone who had watched Sophia's humiliation unfold without intervention. The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension. This was the silence of people being forced to confront their own moral failings. Sophia found her voice, though it trembled with emotion. Mr. Wellington, I'm so sorry about Isabella. I can't imagine how painful this must be for you. Marcus's expression softened as he looked at her. She would have liked you, he said simply. You have the same strength she had, the same refusal to let circumstances define your worth, but unlike Isabella, you're not alone in this moment. The promise in those words hit Sophia like a physical force. For years, she'd navigated the world's cruelties by herself, developing thick skin and low expectations as survival mechanisms. The idea that someone with the power to actually change things, was willing to stand beside her, was almost too overwhelming to process. But Marcus wasn't finished. He turned to address the store at large, his voice taking on the commanding tone of someone accustomed to boardrooms and difficult decisions. Everyone here has witnessed something that should never happen to any young person. You've seen how quickly dignity can be stripped away, how easily cruelty can be disguised as policy. The question now is what you're going to do with that knowledge. He gestured toward Sophia, who stood straighter despite her tears. This remarkable young woman saved $300, working multiple jobs, so she could celebrate her graduation with dignity. She earned an academic scholarship through her own merit. She's dedicating her life to helping other children who've faced the same challenges she has. And your response was to watch in silence while she was humiliated for having the audacity to believe she deserved respect. The accusation hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Several customers looked ashamed, while others seemed genuinely surprised to have their inaction characterized so starkly. Victoria finally found her voice again. Mr. Wellington, please. I understand you're upset, but company policy clearly states that we should focus our attention on customers who are likely to make significant purchases. Company policy, Marcus repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. And who exactly wrote this policy that prioritizes profit over basic human decency? Who decided that teenage customers should be treated as potential threats rather than future clientele? Victoria realized she was digging herself deeper with every word, but desperation made her continue. We have quotas to meet, revenue targets. Management expects us to maximize sales per customer interaction. So you're telling me, Marcus said, his voice rising slightly, that corporate headquarters specifically instructed you to humiliate minors who don't appear wealthy enough to warrant respect? The trap was obvious, but Victoria had already walked into it. Either she admitted to following discriminatory policies, or she acknowledged that her treatment of Sophia was her own choice rather than company mandate. That's not exactly what I meant, she stammered. Then clarify exactly what you did mean, Marcus demanded, because from where I'm standing, it appears that you made a conscious decision to treat a paying customer with cruelty and disrespect based solely on your personal prejudices. Sophia watched the exchange with growing amazement. She'd never seen an adult advocate for her with such fierce determination. The foster system had taught her to expect disappointment from authority figures, to assume that her concerns would be dismissed or minimized. But Marcus was dismantling Victoria's justifications with surgical precision, leaving no room for excuses or deflection. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his decisions implemented without question. "Ms. Sterling, you're going to personally apologize to Sophia for your appalling behavior. A real apology, not corporate damage control." Victoria's face cycled through several emotions: resistance, fear, resignation, before settling on something approaching contrition. "Furthermore," Marcus continued, "you're going to help Sophia find the perfect graduation dress. And you're going to treat her with the same respect and attention you would show any valued customer." The reversal was so complete, so unexpected, that several people in the store actually gasped. Sophia felt her world tilting on its axis as she realized that not only was she not being thrown out of the store, but she was being guaranteed the respect she'd hoped for when she first walked through those gleaming doors. But Marcus saved the biggest surprise for last. "And finally," he said, pulling out his credit card and placing it on the nearest counter, "whatever dress Sophia chooses, whatever accessories she needs, whatever it takes to make her feel as beautiful and confident as she deserves to feel on her graduation day, all of it goes on my account." The silence that followed Marcus's declaration was so profound that the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed thunderous in comparison. Sophia stared at the credit card lying on the marble counter as if it were some exotic artifact from another world, which, in many ways, it was. The simple piece of plastic represented more purchasing power than she'd ever imagined having access to, more than her entire foster family's monthly income. "Sir, I can't," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's too much. I never expected. I just wanted to buy one dress with my own money." Marcus turned to her with an expression that was gentle but absolutely resolute. "Sophia, let me ask you something. If you had the power to prevent another young woman from experiencing what Isabella went through, what would you be willing to sacrifice to make that happen?" The question caught Sophia off guard. She'd expected platitudes about accepting help gracefully, or arguments about deserving kindness. Instead, Marcus was asking her to consider something far more complex, the idea that accepting his generosity might serve a purpose beyond her own needs. I would do anything," she answered honestly. "Then understand that this isn't charity," Marcus said firmly. "This is me ensuring that you walk into your graduation ceremony tomorrow feeling exactly as confident and beautiful as you deserve to feel. Because when you do, when you show the world that young women like you and Isabella can't be broken by the cruelty of small-minded people, you honor her memory in a way that no monument ever could." Victoria Sterling stood frozen between them, caught in a nightmare of her own making. The reversal of power dynamics was so complete that she seemed to have forgotten how to function. The young woman she'd spent 20 minutes systematically humiliating was now being offered unlimited access to the store's most expensive merchandise by one of their most important customers. "Ms. Sterling," Marcus said without looking away from Sophia, "I believe you have an apology to deliver." Victoria's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on an unhealthy pallor. The words she needed to say stuck in her throat like glass shards, each one requiring tremendous effort to dislodge. "Sophia," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I apologize for the way I treated you today. My behavior was inappropriate and inexcusable." Sophia looked at her expectantly, sensing that more was needed, but uncertain how to demand it without seeming petty or vindictive. Marcus, however, had no such reservations. "That's a start, but hardly sufficient. Sophia deserves to understand exactly what you're apologizing for, don't you think?" Victoria's hands trembled as she forced herself to meet Sophia's eyes directly. "I made assumptions about you based on your appearance and your budget. I treated you with disrespect and cruelty. I tried to make you feel unwelcome and unworthy when you had every right to shop here with dignity. There is no excuse for my behavior, and I am deeply sorry." The apology hung in the air between them, imperfect but genuine in its acknowledgement of harm caused. Sophia felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that Victoria's cruelty had come from her own insecurities and prejudices, rather than any truth about Sophia's worth. "Thank you," Sophia said quietly. "I accept your apology." Marcus nodded approvingly, then gestured toward the displays of evening wear that surrounded them. "Now, let's find you the perfect dress for tomorrow." What followed was unlike anything Sophia had ever experienced. Victoria, thoroughly chastened and clearly terrified of further antagonizing Marcus, transformed into the most attentive saleswoman imaginable. She pulled dress after dress for Sophia's consideration, each one more beautiful than the last, treating her with the kind of reverence usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. Other customers, meanwhile, had become an impromptu audience for Sophia's transformation. Word of the dramatic confrontation had spread through the mall's social networks faster than wildfire, and people were finding excuses to browse near prestige fashion boutique, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ongoing story. Sophia found herself in the surreal position of trying on gowns that cost more than her foster family's monthly rent. Each dress was a work of art: flowing silks, intricate beadwork, designer labels that she'd only seen in magazines. But more than their monetary value, what struck her was how differently she was being treated, now that Marcus had claimed her as worthy of respect. "This one," Marcus said, as Sophia emerged from the dressing room wearing a deep navy gown that seemed to have been crafted specifically for her. The colour brought out the warmth in her skin tone, while the elegant cut emphasized her natural grace. "It's perfect." Sophia looked at herself in the three-way mirror and barely recognized the young woman staring back at her. The dress transformed her from a struggling foster kid into someone who belonged in magazine spreads or red carpet events. But more than the external transformation, she could see something different in her own eyes. A confidence that had been building throughout the entire encounter. "Are you sure?" she asked, still unable to fully believe this was happening. "Absolutely certain," Marcus replied. "But we're not finished yet." Victoria, now fully committed to her role as devoted sales assistant, brought out accessories that complemented the dress perfectly. Elegant shoes that actually fit Sophia's feet, a delicate necklace that caught the light beautifully, and a small clutch purse that completed the ensemble. As the final touches were added, Sophia caught sight of her reflection again and felt tears beginning to form. But these weren't tears of humiliation or sadness. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude, and something she'd rarely experienced in her 17 years, the feeling of being truly valued by another human being. "Mr. Wellington," she said, turning to face him directly, "I don't know how to thank you for this, for all of this." Marcus smiled, and for the first time since entering the store, his expression was free of the shadows of grief and anger that had marked his earlier interactions. "You don't need to thank me, Sophia. You just need to promise me something. Anything." Promise me that tomorrow when you walk across that graduation stage, you'll remember this moment. Remember that you have value that can't be diminished by other people's prejudices. Remember that your worth isn't determined by your bank account or your background. And remember that there are people in this world who recognize your strength and potential, even when others try to make you forget it. Sophia nodded, unable to speak past the emotion lodging in her throat. "And promise me one more thing," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a tone of gentle urgency. "Promise me that you'll use your education and your experiences to make the world a little bit kinder for the next young woman who finds herself in a situation like this." "I promise," Sophia whispered, and meant it with every fibre of her being. As Victoria rang up the purchases, a total that made Sophia's head spin, even though she wasn't paying for it, Marcus pulled out his business card and handed it to her. "When you start university, I want you to call me," he said. "I have connections in the social work field, internship opportunities, scholarship programs. Your education is just beginning, and I want to make sure you have every possible advantage." Sophia stared at the card, understanding that what was being offered wasn't just financial support, but mentorship, guidance, and the kind of network that could transform her entire future. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing all this for a stranger?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as he considered how to answer. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Because Isabella can't graduate tomorrow, but you can. Because every young woman who succeeds, despite the odds, is a victory against the forces that tried to break her. And because sometimes, if we're very lucky, we get a second chance to do the right thing." The morning sun streamed through the windows of Central High School's auditorium, casting golden rays across rows of folding chairs that would soon be filled with families celebrating their children's achievements. Sofia Rodriguez stood in the school's makeshift preparation room, staring at her reflection in a borrowed full-length mirror, still unable to fully believe the transformation that had occurred in her life within 24 hours. The navy gown from prestige fashion boutique hung perfectly on her frame, the elegant fabric catching the light in ways that made her appear almost ethereal. The delicate jewelry Marcus had insisted on purchasing complemented her natural beauty without overwhelming it, and the professional styling Victoria had arranged, part of her frantic attempt at redemption, had transformed Sophia's usually simple hairstyle into something worthy of a magazine cover. But more than the external changes, what struck Sophia most profoundly was the difference in how she carried herself. The girl who had entered that boutique yesterday with hunched shoulders and defensive posture had been replaced by someone who stood tall, who met her own gaze in the mirror with confidence rather than uncertainty. "Sofia Rodriguez, you clean up nice." The voice belonged to Carmen Delgado, Sophia's closest friend at Central High, who had just entered the preparation room wearing her own graduation dress, a simple but lovely creation from a department store that suddenly seemed inadequate in comparison to Sophia's designer gown. "Carmen, you look beautiful," Sophia said quickly, sensing her friend's momentary discomfort and wanting to bridge any awkwardness that might arise from their dramatically different attire. "Girl, what happened to you?" Carmen asked, her eyes wide as she took in every detail of Sophia's transformation. "Yesterday you were stressed about spending $300, and today you look like you stepped off a red carpet. Did you rob a bank?" Sophia laughed, but the sound was tinged with the emotional weight of everything she'd experienced. "Something like that. Actually, something incredible happened at the boutique yesterday. Something that changed everything." As Sophia recounted the previous day's events, Carmen's expressions shifted from skepticism to amazement to something approaching awe. The story seemed too extraordinary to be real. The cruel treatment, Marcus's unexpected intervention, the revelation about Isabella, the complete reversal of fortune that had followed. "Wait, let me get this straight," Carmen said when Sophia finished her narrative. A millionaire businessman basically adopted you as his protege because you reminded him of his deceased daughter, and now he's paying for your college expenses. Not exactly adopted, Sophia corrected carefully. More like he's become a mentor, someone who believes in my potential and wants to help me succeed. Me too. But even as she said the words, Sophia recognized that the relationship felt deeper than typical mentorship. The way Marcus had looked at her, the fierce protectiveness he'd displayed, the emotional investment he'd made in her future, it all suggested something more profound than professional guidance. "Sophia," Carmen said gently, "you realize this is like winning the lottery, right? People don't just encounter guardian angels in shopping malls." Before Sophia could respond, Mrs. Patterson, their English teacher and graduation coordinator, burst into the room with barely controlled excitement. "Sophia, there you are. You have visitors in the main office. Very important visitors, apparently. Principal Johnson wants to see you immediately." Sophia's stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. In her experience, being called to the principal's office rarely resulted in good news. Had something gone wrong with her graduation eligibility? Was there some last-minute issue with her scholarship to State University? "Go," Carmen urged, recognizing her friend's nervousness. "I'll save your place in the graduation lineup." Sophia made her way through the hallways of Central High School, her heels clicking against the polished linoleum floors that had been her second home for 4 years. The building held so many memories, some painful, some triumphant, all contributing to the resilience that had brought her to this moment. When she entered the main office, Sophia was surprised to find not just Principal Johnson waiting for her, but Marcus Wellington and an elegant woman she didn't recognize. Marcus wore a perfectly tailored suit that spoke of wealth and importance, while the woman beside him radiated the kind of refined grace that suggested significant social standing. "Sophia," Principal Johnson said, his voice carrying unusual warmth, "I'd like you to meet Mr. and Mrs. Wellington." The introduction hit Sophia like a physical force. This was Marcus's wife, the woman whose custom gown he'd been picking up at the boutique when he'd witnessed Sophia's humiliation. Sophia felt a moment of panic, wondering if Mrs. Wellington resented her husband's emotional investment in a stranger's welfare. But as Eleanor Wellington stepped forward, her expression was one of genuine warmth rather than suspicion or resentment. "Sophia," Eleanor said, her voice cultured but kind. "Marcus told me about meeting you yesterday. I hope you don't mind that I insisted on coming to your graduation." Sophia looked between Marcus and Eleanor, trying to understand the dynamics at play. Of course not. But I don't understand why." Marcus stepped forward, and Sophia could see that he was struggling with some internal decision. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who had spent the entire night wrestling with emotions too complex to easily navigate. "Sophia, yesterday when I met you, when I heard your story and saw your strength, it awakened something in me that I thought had died with Isabella. Not just grief or regret, but hope. The possibility that perhaps I could honor her memory by ensuring that another remarkable young woman had every opportunity to succeed." Eleanor moved to stand beside her husband, her hand finding his in a gesture of support that spoke of years of shared sorrow and mutual understanding. "We've spent the night talking," Eleanor continued, "about Isabella, about loss, about the ways that healing can take unexpected forms, and we've come to a decision that we hope you'll consider carefully." Sophia felt her heart beginning to race. There was something in their manner, something in the way they stood together and looked at her, that suggested this conversation was leading somewhere momentous. "We know you're 18 next month," Marcus said, his voice steady but emotional. "We know you're legally considered an adult and that you have plans for university, a career path you're passionate about, dreams you've worked incredibly hard to achieve. But we also know," Eleanor added gently, "that you've spent most of your life without the kind of family support that every young person deserves. Without parents who attend your graduations, who celebrate your successes, who worry about your welfare not because it's their job, but because they love you. Sophia felt tears beginning to form as she began to understand what they were suggesting. The possibility was too extraordinary to fully process, too wonderful to dare believe. "We're not trying to replace the family you've lost," Marcus said carefully. "Nothing could ever do that. But we're hoping you might allow us to become the family you choose. Eleanor and I would be honored if you would consider allowing us to legally adopt you." The words hung in the air like a prayer, fragile and powerful simultaneously. Sophia felt her knees weaken as the full magnitude of what was being offered crashed over her. "You want to adopt me?" she whispered, barely able to speak past the emotion constricting her throat. "We want to give you what Isabella would have wanted for any young woman in your situation," Eleanor said, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "We want to give you a family who will support your dreams, celebrate your achievements, and love you unconditionally." Principal Johnson, who had been observing this extraordinary scene with growing amazement, cleared his throat gently. "Sophia, your graduation ceremony begins in 30 minutes. Obviously, this is an enormous decision that doesn't need to be made today. But I think Mr. and Mrs. Wellington wanted you to know, before you walk across that stage, that your future holds possibilities you might never have imagined." Sophia looked at Marcus and Eleanor Wellington, this couple who had experienced devastating loss but had chosen to respond with love rather than bitterness, who saw in her not a charity case but a daughter worth claiming. "I don't know what to say," Sophia admitted, her voice breaking with emotion. "You don't have to say anything right now," Marcus replied gently. "Just know that regardless of your decision, Eleanor and I will be in that auditorium watching you graduate with the pride that parents feel when their child achieves something extraordinary." As if on cue, the opening strains of Pomp and Circumstance began to play over the school's sound system, signaling that the graduation ceremony was about to begin. "Go," Eleanor said, reaching out to adjust a strand of Sophia's hair with maternal tenderness. "Go walk across that stage, knowing that you've already accomplished something remarkable just by being who you are." Sophia made her way back to the preparation room in a daze, her mind struggling to process the emotional whirlwind of the last 24 hours. As she took her place in the graduation lineup, she caught sight of herself in the mirror one final time. The young woman looking back at her was the same person who had entered Prestige Fashion Boutique yesterday, but somehow everything had changed. She was no longer alone in the world. She was no longer without advocates, without family, without hope for a future filled with love and possibility. As the graduation processional began and Sophia took her first steps toward the stage where she would receive her diploma, she carried with her not just her own achievements, but the love of a family who had chosen her, the memory of a girl named Isabella who would live on through Sophia's success, and the knowledge that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simple act of one person refusing to let another suffer alone. 1 year later, Sophia Wellington stood at the podium of the annual Children's Advocacy Foundation Gala, looking out at an audience of 500 of the city's most influential philanthropists and social workers. The transformation from the frightened teenager in Prestige Fashion Boutique to the confident young woman addressing this distinguished gathering was nothing short of miraculous. 12 months ago, Sophia began, her voice clear and strong, I thought my worth was measured by the $300 I had saved for a graduation dress. Today, I stand before you as living proof that a person's value cannot be calculated in dollars, but in the courage to dream beyond their circumstances. In the front row, Marcus and Eleanor Wellington beamed with parental pride. The adoption had been finalized 3 months after graduation, and Sophia had officially become their daughter in every sense that mattered. The legal paperwork had been mere formality, The bonds of love and mutual respect had been forged in that boutique through shared pain and hope. My parents taught me that healing often comes through helping others, Sophia continued, gesturing toward Marcus and Eleanor. They showed me that when we transform our own pain into purpose, we honor not just our own journey, but the memory of those who couldn't complete theirs. The Isabella Martinez Foundation, named for Marcus's first daughter, had become Sophia's passion project during her first year at State University. Using her personal story and the Wellingtons' resources, she had created scholarship programs for foster children, mentorship networks for at-risk youth, and most importantly, sensitivity training for retail establishments to prevent the kind of humiliation she had experienced. Victoria Sterling, the manager who once told me I didn't belong, now serves as our head of corporate training, Sophia announced, causing a ripple of surprise through the audience. Because redemption isn't just for those who suffer, it's also for those who cause suffering, but choose to learn and grow. The partnership with Victoria had been Sophia's idea, much to everyone's surprise. Instead of seeking revenge, Sophia had recognized that Victoria's behavior stemmed from corporate pressure and personal insecurity. By offering her a chance to become part of the solution, Sophia had transformed a former enemy into one of their most effective advocates. Tonight, I'm proud to announce that the Isabella Martinez Foundation has secured commitments from 50 major retailers across the country to implement our Dignity First customer service standards. Never again will a young person be humiliated for having the audacity to dream beyond their bank account. The applause was thunderous, but Sophia raised her hand for silence. She had one more announcement, one that would complete the circle of healing that had begun in that boutique. Finally, I want to share that next month, my family will be welcoming a new member. Maria Gonzalez, a 15-year-old aging out of foster care, will be joining the Wellington family through adoption, because families aren't just born, they're chosen, they're built, and they're expanded through love. As Sophia concluded her speech to a standing ovation, she caught sight of a familiar figure in the back of the ballroom. Carmen Delgado, now her college roommate and closest friend, held up a sign that read, "Still can't believe you robbed that bank." Later that evening, as the family returned home to the Wellington estate that had become Sophia's sanctuary, Marcus pulled out a familiar photograph, the picture of Isabella that had changed everything. "She would be so proud," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just of what you've accomplished, but of how you've chosen to accomplish it, with grace, with forgiveness, with love, instead of bitterness." Sophia took the photograph, studying the face of the sister she'd never met, but whose legacy lived on through every life she touched. "She's still changing the world," Sophia replied. "Through every scholarship we award, every policy we change, every young person we convince that their dreams matter, Isabella's story continues." Eleanor wrapped her arms around both her husband and daughter, completing the circle of love that had emerged from tragedy. "This is what healing looks like," she whispered, "not forgetting the pain, but transforming it into something beautiful." As Sophia prepared for bed that night in the room that had once belonged to Isabella but was now truly hers, she reflected on the miraculous journey that had brought her here. From a frightened foster child to a confident advocate, from isolation to belonging, from survival to purpose. The girl who had walked into prestige fashion boutique with $300 and a heart full of hope had emerged as Sophia Wellington, daughter, advocate, and living testament to the truth that every person deserves dignity, respect, and the chance to transform their circumstances through love and determination. Tomorrow, she would return to State University to continue her studies in social work. Next month, she would welcome a new sister into their family. Next year, she would graduate with honors and begin her career as a professional advocate for children's rights. But tonight, she was simply a daughter, loved unconditionally by parents who had chosen her not despite her past, but because of the strength and character it had forged within her. The transformation was complete, but the story would continue. One act of kindness, one moment of courage, one choice to see dignity in every person at a time.